all for being here. There is a lot going on today, and so I hope that my colleagues who intend to show up will be able to come. But if they're not able to, this is no reflection on the interest and their support for what we're doing today. And so I thank all of the witnesses for being here today to discuss how we can work together to protect our country's students and public schools. Like the vast majority of Americans, I am a product of the public school system and have experienced firsthand the power of our public schools. That doesn't mean that we can't improve, but nonetheless, the majority of our kids go to public schools. And as an immigrant, I learned to read and write English thanks to public school educators in Hawaii. And I know there are millions of students across the nation with similar stories, students who have learned, grown, and thrived thanks to our teachers, our educators, and our public school system. Again, the vast majority of our kids go to public schools, but frankly, we have a regime that wants to end federal support for public schools by getting rid of the Department of Education altogether. And they're not able to do that because Congress created the Department of Education, and this regime can't just do away with it, but they can do a lot of things that will harm support for public schools, and that is why we are here today. And of course, the regime, I call it the regime because it is an authoritarian bunch of people who are trying to run this country. But this regime has already cut staff, the US DOE staff, by 50%. And now they've come up with a way to subsidize private schools to the tune of $4 billion per year in tax credits. And I think this particular method has not sunk in with our public, but to know that the Republicans have come up with yet another way to enable basically the richest people in our country to send their money to be used by private schools, for which they will get a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. So we have come to the conclusion that the current regime doesn't give a rip about students or teachers. Republicans are actively working to dismantle the Department of Education and attack our public school system in a way that I have not experienced in the time that I have been in elected office, and that's going on 40 years or so. So, I mean, this kind of frontal assault on the part of the federal government and this regime against public schools is really untoward. So as I mentioned, now they're pushing a massive school voucher tax credit in this big, ugly reconciliation bill, which is why I thank each of you for being here today. And the school voucher provisions in the budget reconciliation bill would divert crucial resources as much as $20 billion or more in perpetuity. That's the thing, the Senate bill, in perpetuity, that these people will get a tax credit for programs that benefit wealthy families who already send their children to private schools. Rather than investing these resources in public schools, making sure we can feed our kids, for example, Republicans are sending them to private schools. Everyone should be aware, Republicans are creating the first ever national school voucher program that will be funded through a new federal tax credit for individuals and corporations who support private schools. This program will hurt underserved students, including those in rural communities. It will hurt students with disabilities, and it would hurt their families. Needless to say, this proposal poses a serious threat to our public education system, as well as the communities, families, and students who rely on our public schools, our educators, and the resources that they provide. For years, research has shown that school voucher programs do not produce better results for students. And rather than invest in our nation's public schools and the students they serve, Republicans are actively working to shortchange public education to fund unregulated private schools. I repeat, to fund unregulated private schools. Public education is a great equalizer. It gives people the opportunity to succeed in school and in life, no matter where they come from. And that is why Republicans are so hell-bent on undermining it. And as they continue their attacks on our schools and educators, Democrats are fighting to ensure that every child in this country can receive a quality public education. Today's Spotlight Forum takes another important step in this fight by informing families about this toxic provision in the big ugly bill and the threat it poses to our nation's children and our educators. And despite what Republicans may say, this provision isn't about supporting students. It's just another way to provide wealthy individuals with another tax break. It's not about improving academic achievement or offering parents with real school choice. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and my colleagues as we work to combat these blatant attacks on our public schools system. I do want to introduce our panelists. Okay. We'll start with Dr. John Valant, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Of Brookings Institution. Dr. Valant is the director of the Brown Center on Education Policy and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He holds the Herman and George R. Brown Chair in Education Studies. As a researcher, he specializes in K-12 education policy with a particular focus on equity. As such, he is widely considered a leading expert on school choice politics, including private school voucher programs. Welcome, Doctor. Ms. Katy Neas from the ARC. Ms. Neas is the Chief Executive Officer of the ARC of the United States, the largest community-based organization advocating for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States. In this capacity, she leads the ARC's national office and state and local networks of nearly 600 chapters, providing support to over 1 million people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary in the Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. She is considered an expert on programs like IDEA. Welcome, Ms. Neas. Dr. Justin Henry, Goddard Public Schools of Wichita, Kansas. Dr. Henry has served as the superintendent of Goddard Public Schools since 2011. He previously served as a superintendent of the southeast of, Saline School District, and as a high school principal. Know a lot about education on the ground. In addition to working for Goddard Public Schools, he also works as a professor at Ottawa University. He also acts in several local, state, and national organizations, as active, I should say. In 2021, he was selected as the Kansas State Superintendent of the Year. Welcome, Dr. Henry. Mr. Paul Schulte. He is with the Millard Public Schools of Omaha, Nebraska. Mr. Schulte serves as an elementary school teacher at Millard Public Schools in Omaha, Nebraska, where he has been a teacher for 26 years. He currently teaches 4th grade, but previously taught 3rd grade. He also previously worked as a school librarian. And I have to tell you, I love school librarians because my elementary school librarian awakened my love of reading, which I think is foundational to an immigrant kid learning to read and write and speak English. So a special aloha to you as a librarian. So he has served on the board of directors for the Nebraska School Education Association for 14 years. and currently serves as the Vice President of the NSEA. He is also the Vice President for Support Our Schools Nebraska, the organization that successfully pushed back against school vouchers in his state. Welcome. Am I missing somebody? No. Okay, what happened?
We should have
Hold on for a second. Take a break, everybody. Oh. Is this it?
yes.
Okay. Ms. Alexis Underwood, Bay County School District of Panama City, Florida. Ms. Underwood serves as a middle school language arts teacher at Mowat Middle School in Bay County, Florida, where she teaches students in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. She is also the president of the Association of Bay County Educators, which is a chapter of the Florida Education Association. Welcome, Ms. Underwood. So we are going to start with Mr. Valant. Dr. Valant, please.
Thank you, Senator Hirono, for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is John Valant. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a nonpartisan think tank, where I'm the director of the Brown
Can
Center.
you all make sure to speak into your mics,
Yes,
please?
sorry. Where I'm at the Brown Center on Education Policy, and the views I express today are my own. As you know, this has been a hard decade for America's students. They've suffered from an inadequate response to COVID learning loss, increasing strains on their mental health, sudden changes to the workforce that awaits them, and culture war conflicts that have infected our politics and our policymaking. This is a time when we should be rethinking educational policy and practice. We need reforms that respond to the challenges of the day and prepare students for tomorrow. I worry, however, that where major changes are happening, those changes are more likely to exacerbate our problems than to solve them. I'm talking in particular about a recent wave of private school choice reforms. Many Americans are familiar with the basic idea of school vouchers. The government offers funds to families that they can use to pay for private school tuition. We've seen voucher programs rise over the years. Most of these programs are small and targeted to students with particular needs, such as students in poverty or students with disabilities. At best, they have a mixed record of performance, and some have produced dismal academic results. Over the last few years, a new breed of private school choice programs has emerged. These are much larger than past voucher programs and less targeted to students in need. I'd like to take a minute to describe the two key types of programs. The first are Universal Educational Savings Account, or ESA programs. These are primarily state-level programs. The second are tax credit scholarship programs, and the federal government might soon create a 50-state tax credit scholarship program through the budget reconciliation process, that being known as the Educational Choice for Children Act, or ECHA. So to start with those universal ESA programs, over the last few years, several states have created ESA programs to cover private school tuition or other expenses for nearly all families, regardless of need. Arizona was the first out of the gate, which makes it an especially important program to monitor. And we don't know much about how Arizona's universal ESA program is affecting student outcomes, and it's not clear that we ever will. That's because the program, like many ESAs, lacks transparency or accountability for student outcomes. We do, however, know something about who is receiving those funds. Most of Arizona's early ESA recipients were already attending private schools. The highest ESA participation rates were in the wealthiest zip codes. The lowest participation rates were in the poorest zip codes. Those patterns aren't unique to Arizona. Other states' ESA programs share this pattern of higher participation rates in higher income areas and disproportionate participation from families already enrolled in private schools. Why is that the case? One possible explanation involves the location of private schools. Rural communities, which tend to have relatively low average incomes, have far fewer private schools nearby. Rural families may have less use for ESA funds. Another explanation involves the gap between the cost of attending private school and the value of most states' ESA offerings. Often, families must pay several $1,000s to cover that difference. That can be too much for families without much disposable income. Moreover, private schools may increase their tuition rates in response to the introduction of an ESA program. A study from Princeton University found evidence of this occurring in Iowa. Those are ESA programs. Now let's take ECHA, which is the proposed federal tax credit scholarship program. With tax credit scholarship programs, money moves in circuitous ways to avoid the legal and maybe political obstacles that confront vouchers. The basic idea is that a donor gives money to a scholarship granting organization, or an SGO, and the SGO then provides a voucher to families. The donor receives a tax credit for their contribution. ECA is unusual in a lot of respects, even for a tax credit scholarship program, and we should think about both the donors and the SGOs as they're outlined in ECA. The donors are more likely to make money than to give money away. That's because ECA allows individuals to donate stock to SGOs and receive a full one-to-one tax credit for their contribution. In effect, this makes ECA a tax shelter that provides wealthy individuals with an avenue for avoiding capital gains taxes. It's not the donors who fund the program, it's taxpayers, and they're likely subsidizing wealthy individuals along the way. Now consider the SGOs. Under ECA, SGOs are hardly regulated at all. This means, for example, that an SGO could designate its funds for schools that refuse to enroll students of a certain sexual orientation, religion, or political party. In addition, there are only the slightest forms of transparency and accountability, and a lot of room for waste and abuse. Let's consider a brief illustration of how this could look. This scenario looks to me entirely compliant with both the House and the Senate bills. Say a billionaire hears that he can avoid paying capital gains taxes by moving funds to an SGO. He encourages his friend to start an SGO that steers funds to their wealthy community. Our billionaire donates $2 million of stock to the SGO, which he gets back in full as a tax credit. Because he didn't have to pay capital gains taxes on his earnings, he's made money on that arrangement. His friend who runs the SGO gets to take a 10% cut of that $2 million for himself. He then could hand out $50,000 apiece to some wealthy local families with a stipulation that LGBTQ kids need not apply. My team has analyzed ECA to assess which families are likely to benefit. We found that rural families are poised to benefit the least, while many high-income individuals in high-income areas will be likely to obtain funds for themselves. A study by the Urban Institute draws similar conclusions. In stepping back, I think we should remind ourselves about the federal government's role in K-12 education. Historically, that role has emphasized data collection and transparency, protecting students from discrimination, and compensatory funding for students in need. I would argue that we should evaluate ECA through that lens. Now, before concluding, I'd like to be clear about one point that I am not making today. I am not saying that the status quo for US schools is good enough. It quite clearly is not. We have a lot of work to do to ensure that all students, regardless of their lot in life, enjoy the lifelong benefits of outstanding teachers, high-quality curriculum, and nurturing school environments. The reality, however, is that policies hostile to public schools are unlikely to achieve those outcomes and risk leaving us with a more stratified, less efficient education system than the one we have today. Thank you. I will look forward to your questions in today's discussion.
Thank you very much. Ms. Neas?
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to start my remarks today with sharing the experience of my friend Bert and his fourth grade son, Jack, who has Down syndrome. Jack's third grade teacher labeled him as a behavior problem. Jack's a happy guy who'd had no previous trouble at school. His pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade teachers all never raised this concern. So Bert hired an advocate to find out what was going on and learned that Jack was receiving none of the services that were spelled out in his individualized plan. Bert said he felt like the school had just given up on Jack. But the story has a somewhat happy ending. Bert was able to find another public school that welcomed Jack, and I'm happy to report that Jack's had a great fourth grade year. We don't know, and Bert doesn't know, what changed at Jack's longtime school, the school his little brother still attends. It could have been that his third grade teacher didn't know how to work with a child with Down syndrome, or didn't understand that that child had a right to be in school, or that the principal didn't offer any supports, or that there were 40 other kids in the class due to personnel shortages, or they'd had a previous bad experience with a parent that made collaboration challenging, or that the teacher simply didn't want this child in the class. All we do know was that Jack was not receiving an appropriate education despite the promise of the federal law. Bert and his family's experience highlight the need for a robust Department of Education and its effective oversight of its activities. I'd like to share with you another story, and this happened just a couple years ago. Parents in Texas discovered that the state had set an arbitrary cap on the number of children who could receive special education services. This cap was set at 8.5%, even though nearly 15% of children in most states are eligible for special education services. These parents reached out to the Department of Education, and the department worked very closely with the state, guiding them on what they needed to do to fix this problem. After months of collaboration, the Texas removed the cap, and now children who are eligible are actually receiving services in the state of Texas. So the Department of Education does more than just provide support to state departments of education. It funds training for special education teachers. It drives innovation on how we educate students with disabilities. It supports parents, and it enforces disability rights laws. In fact, the largest number of complaints filed with the U.S. Department of Education are from parents of students with disabilities. In many of these cases, the department works directly with school districts to resolve these issues and improve services. But all of these activities were undermined when half the staff at the department were riffed and when the Trump administration issued an executive order to dismantle the department. Congress is also exploring policies that put at risk access to educational opportunities for students with disabilities. The Education Choice for Children's Act, which you've heard, holy smokes, a lot about, which proposes a national private school voucher program, really concerns us. I think it's important to remember that the right to a free and appropriate public education for eligible students with disabilities has never been predicated on public funding of education. Children with disabilities have the right to a public education, even if federal and state funds are removed from the public education system. But with less funding, states are going to be extremely challenged to meet these obligations. How will a state ensure that every child has a qualified teacher? How will the state deliver specialized services like speech therapy and occupational therapy? The simple answer is it's going to be really hard. We also have concerns about access to private schools. These schools can deny enrollment to students with disabilities simply because they have disabilities. In addition, school choice initiatives may not cover the full cost of attending a private school. The average per pupil expenditure is about $17,000. The voucher program in question would cover $5,000. So do parents understand that they're expected to make up the difference? So the combination of the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education and the reduction in federal funding will have profoundly negative consequences for children with disabilities. And it's at a time when education policy for our kids has always been a place where Congress has found common ground. So we really thank you for having this hearing, and we need leaders at all levels of government to come together to do what's right for our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit this afternoon about vouchers. As stated earlier, I'm currently beginning my 19th year as a superintendent of public schools in Kansas. Got me? My first 4 years as a superintendent were in a rural district. The last 15 have been in one of Kansas's largest and fastest growing suburban districts. As a son and grandson of public school educators, I believe each generation of educators not only has the daily responsibility to impact students, but the duty to advocate for a system that best supports all students. The nation's public schools exist to make good on America's promise that every child in every community has the opportunity to dream, to plan, and succeed. It's a promise that I and all educators take seriously and support daily. Vouchers seek to undermine this promise and take critical resources away from our public schools that serve 90% of the nation's students. Here's what we know about vouchers. First, vouchers funnel taxpayer dollars to private schools that are not required to adhere to the same laws and accountability systems. In fact, they can deny any student they deem unsuitable for any reason. Meanwhile, America's public schools educate all students in every community regardless of their ability, background, or income level. Secondly, vouchers do not achieve the stated goal of getting students out of low-performing schools and closing learning gaps. In fact, recent research out of Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio have shown that students who use vouchers perform worse academically than their public school peers. Third, Publicly funding private education leads to a dramatic deinvestment in public schools. When school districts lose students and funding, superintendents and boards of education are forced to make impossible decisions where to cut, many times impacting staff. Regardless of what cuts are made, it all means that public school students lose access to critical opportunities and resources they need to succeed after they graduate. Fourth, private school vouchers don't work in rural areas as they do in urban areas. The choices are very limited. If students are able to use a voucher, they are generally required to endure long, costly commutes. Vouchers are especially harmful to rural schools because they're then forced to spread the same operating cost over a smaller revenue stream. This, in turn, can lead to forced school consolidation, which is a hotly contested topic in all rural states. In rural communities, the schools are more than where kids just go to school. Schools are the heartbeat of the community. They're the meeting location for civic groups, they're the voting location for residents, and even serve as emergency shelters. When a rural school loses funding and students, the entire community feels the impact, which soon threatens the future existence of that community. Throughout Kansas and many rural states, a majority of rural communities are doing all they can to hold on and keep their communities alive. When the schools close, so do the communities, and generations of traditions and pride soon fade away. The expansion of vouchers will have a negative impact on these communities. Vouchers and school choice don't work with a one-size-fits-all federal approach. I'm deeply concerned with the current proposal moving through Congress to establish the first ever national private school voucher program. The proposal will divert billions of taxpayer dollars away from public schools through a dollar-for-dollar tax credit for individuals who can donate to private schools. America's public schools welcome all students without discrimination and are the unifying factor among diverse communities within our society. However, voucher programs threaten this essential mission by redirecting much-needed public funds to private schools, benefiting only a small number of students and actually offering no real reform. Instead of diverting resources to private schools, the federal government should be focused on strengthening our public schools and upholding their commitment to all students, including those with our most intense and complex needs. It's unique that this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the landmark legislation that promised every student a free and appropriate education. Recognizing that this would require additional resources, Congress promised to cover 40% of the additional costs necessary to ensure every student receives a high-quality education that they deserve. However, 50 years later, Congress is not providing the critical funding schools need to support students. Yet the Senate version of the proposal provides $4 billion a year to private schools that are permitted to reject any student and often discriminate against students with disabilities. In short, we cannot afford to fund a secondary system for education that gets to pick and choose who and how we educate. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator Hirono, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the educators, students, and families of Nebraska. I come to you as an educator of 26 years. I've taught kindergarten, served as a teacher librarian, taught third grade, and currently teach fourth grade in the state of Nebraska. The citizens of my state have sent a clear and resounding message. They do not want public tax dollars diverted to private schools. In November 2024, the people in Nebraska, the second house of our unique unicameral system, voted 57 to 43% to repeal LB 1402, a bill that funneled state funds to private and parochial schools. This wasn't the first time Nebraskans said no to voucher schemes. They've consistently rejected efforts to undermine our public schools. Each time vouchers appeared before Nebraska's voters in 1966, 1970, 1972, and most recently in 2024, they were resoundingly defeated. Nebraskans don't want to see their public tax dollars subsidizing private schools. Since Senator Lou Ann Linehan, a staunch voucher proponent, took office in 2017, she was introducing bills year after year aimed at creating charter schools, vouchers, and so-called opportunity scholarships. In 2023, she succeeded with LB 753. But rather than let voters have their say, political maneuvering undermined the will of the people. That's when the Nebraska State Education Association took action. Through our 501c4 Support Our Schools Nebraska, we organized a statewide signature drive gathering over 117,000 signatures to place LB 753 on the ballot. The people were ready to vote, and many were ready to tell their stories. But instead of facing the voters, LB 753 was repealed and tucked inside a new bill, LB 1402, effectively canceling the people's right to weigh in. 33 state senators chose to ignore the signatures and silence their constituents. In some districts, those senators represented areas with as few as a dozen private school students. This wasn't leadership. It was disregard for democracy. So we got back to work. And for the second summer in a row, we collected tens of thousands of signatures, over 87,000 signatures to put LB 1402 on the ballot. The response was even more emotional. People weren't just confused, they were angry. In Broken Bow, I met a 90-year-old woman volunteering at her church's vacation Bible school. She signed our petition, and then she went and sent every other volunteer over to do the same. Her message was simple. I love my church. I love my faith, but public funds don't belong in private religious education. If you want to send your child to private school, that is a choice that you make, but you then choose to pay for that choice. This summer, as I traveled across the state, I'm once again hearing from Nebraskans that they are frustrated that congressional members know better than their constituents. From every corner of Nebraska, there's broad agreement. Public dollars should stay in public schools. And yet here we are again, this time on the federal stage. The budget reconciliation bill passed by the House, which is now before the Senate, includes a federal voucher program that would weaken public schools nationwide, including in states like mine that have publicly rejected vouchers again and again. If Congress moves forward with this voucher plan, we risk draining billions of public dollars away from schools that serve every student in every zip code. So I'm here today to ask you, stand with us. Stand with rural families, stand with educators. Stand with the hundreds of thousands of Nebraskans who raise their voices against private school vouchers. We urge all members to reject this voucher program and all future proposed federal voucher programs. This is not about party lines. This is also not about rural versus urban living. It is about doing what's right for our students, our communities, and our future. Let's protect local control. Let's protect democracy, and let's protect the promise of a strong, equitable, and inclusive public education system for every child in every corner of America. Thank you.
Senator Hirano, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today to highlight the harms of private school voucher programs and to urge all senators to reject the inclusion of a voucher scheme as part of the budget reconciliation bill now moving through Congress. My name is Alexis Underwood, and I'm a language arts and reading teacher for students with learning and behavioral disabilities in grades 6 through 8 in Bay County, Florida. But I haven't always been a teacher. I served in the United States Marine Corps for 2.5 years before being honorably discharged after blowing out my knees. I then became an executive at a Fortune 500 insurance company. But when my kids got older, I began to want a career that had deeper meaning, so I became a teacher. Now, I'm a strange creature. I'm a middle school teacher. I can do eye rolls, body odor, and teenage hormones 10 months a year and still like kids when I come out the other end. During my 2 decades of experience, I've seen the importance public schools have, not only for the education of our children, but to our community as a whole. For example, my home, Bay County, in the Florida Panhandle, was hit hard by Hurricane Michael in 2018. Hurricane Michael made landfall in the Panhandle as an unprecedented Category 5 hurricane, and the impact was enormous. Every home and every family in my county was impacted, and many of our students and families lost everything but the clothes they were wearing. But our public schools, like they are all across the country, are pillars of our community. As our community was recovering from Hurricane Michael, our schools became centers of support for our entire community. Schools became shelters for both families and pets in the aftermath. And the first disaster recovery meetings happened in schools as they were the only large spaces built strongly enough to still be able to open even if we didn't have electricity. Schools opened in my community within just a few weeks, with most high schools serving shifts of students, as we had to break the day in half, doing middle school kids in the morning and high school kids in the afternoon in the same space. My school was the site of a huge effort, sponsored by one of our national unions, to provide a space to distribute clothes, household supplies, and non-perishable food. My school, Mowat, was the home of a National Guard unit that came to help us, and my classroom was a first aid clinic for Guard members. And we, as a community, are still not done rebuilding. One of the union leaders in my district is just now rebuilding her home and hopes to move out of the travel trailer that's been her home since October of 2019 before we go back to school again. And after Michael came COVID, and our bus drivers delivered meals to our kids every day during lockdown, running the routes they used to pick up kids, to distribute food to struggling families. Schools became the lifeline to our children, providing them with learning, enrichment, and love when the world shut down. Our public schools and public education help to hold our communities together. Our public schools are where all students are welcome, and where teachers like me, with pedagogical knowledge and years of experience, can help support students, helping them learn to read and getting them farther, faster than a person without that knowledge. There is strong accountability in our public schools, where everything is measured and tested within an inch of its life. And our public schools need more funding, not less. But private school vouchers turn all of this on their heads. Private schools do not need to, and don't, accept all students. They can exclude students based on academic performance, a student or family member being LGBTQ, the student's religion, or a student's disability. Non-public schools don't have the same requirements in terms of teacher qualifications. Perhaps that's why research shows vouchers harm educational achievement, where there is data. And in many places there's not, because most voucher programs don't have good oversight and accountability. And private school vouchers undermine public schools as they siphon money away from public education to subsidize the private education of a select few. Unfortunately, I know this all too well from my home state of Florida, and we've seen the impact firsthand in Bay County. Florida has a lot of voucher schemes, including a tuition tax credit program like the one being proposed in the reconciliation bill now being considered. In Florida, families can claim $8,000 for vouchers for every school-age child in their family. With minimal oversight built into the program, there's been so much waste and fraud, the state is actually changing how it distributes funding this year so that the funding will go every quarter instead of once. As it is, authorized purchases have included paddle boards, televisions, and theme park admissions for Florida parks such as Disney World, SeaWorld, Universal, and Legoland. And yet we can't assess how well these kids are learning because private and voucher kids don't take the standardized tests that measure every other teacher and child in Florida's public schools. I've seen students arrive in our classrooms after years at non-public schools who are years behind in their reading level. There are some students who come in and out of our classrooms and schools multiple times in the same year, as the non-public schools just don't meet the kids' needs. Non-public schools often lack the knowledge and expertise to identify behavioral and learning disabilities at a young age, where expert help from trained educators can make such a massive difference in the future of a child's life. Students are welcome in our classrooms no matter what their circumstances. And even when the voucher funding has already gone out to a private school that the student has since left, we welcome the child. The result of Florida's push to privatize our schools has led to so much turmoil, including budget turmoil, that the plan for a new school in a rapidly developing area of Bay County may now be on hold. The rise of voucher funding has made the already difficult job of planning for the future educational needs of my county much more challenging. And this past school year, our school district and many others in Florida was actually charged back funding. The state required we pay money back in the middle of a year based on charter enrollments. We don't have millions of dollars just sitting around in public education. So as students bounce in and out of private schools, and as private schools can pick and choose to only accept the students who have less need for intensive resources to succeed, public schools will be left with fewer resources to educate the students who need more. As a teacher for students with disabilities, the long-term math of that funding is what I have nightmares about. I hope that Congress will invest in our public schools, which give all students what they need to succeed, and reject efforts like the voucher tax scheme and the reconciliation bill that'll undermine public education. Our children deserve the best that we as a society can give them. They deserve better than this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Hirono. I'm trying to remember exactly when it happened because I was a member of the Appropriations Committee and the senator from Ohio, Mike DeWine, offered a program for the District of Columbia, Opportunity, I'm trying to find the name again, but it was a voucher system in the District of Columbia, Opportunity Scholarships. And it was interesting to me. Full confession, 19 years of Catholic education. So I'm just going to lay it on the table. I thought I got a good education and I didn't run into some of the problems that we were identifying. But I asked some basic questions when this opportunity program was created. Basic questions like who's going to decide the quality of the teachers in these school situations? What kind of curriculum will be offered? What kind of measurement of success or failure will there be? And ultimate question, will the student be better off as a result of attending these so-called voucher schools, which included a lot of things. Here's a couple things that I discovered. The Catholic schools were fairly predictable because it's a model that's been used for decades, if not longer. But many of these schools were a last-minute creation. There were some churches in the District of Columbia where the pastor said, if my wife is the principal and my daughter is the teacher, we've got a school in the basement, so come on down. And the net result of it was not a very positive experience for these students. School didn't last long. In fact, we couldn't find many of the schools several years later when we went out to measure them. That was a problem. Then there was the question of homeschooling. And I know this because it's a family experience. I won't go into any detail, where some of my relatives decided for religious reasons that they were going to homeschool their children so they wouldn't be exposed to the terrible conduct of public school students. The net result of it was not a good one. When it was all said and done, their kids, whom they were nominally homeschooling, couldn't read and spent the rest of their lives paying for that miseducation, if it was one. So I wonder if we get into a tax credit situation, whether or not there'll be measurements to avoid the excesses which I've noted. I know that you've all spoken to this before I arrived, so I won't try to duplicate any remarks. Ms. Neas, I don't think there were many, if any, disabled children in my Catholic schools, and very few minority students. And I'm wondering what happens with these young people who are disabled when they go through this experience.
It's a great question, Senator. Some Catholic schools are doing a great job meeting the needs of kids with disabilities. Many of them won't take kids with disabilities. And certainly the families that I represent, families with kids with Down syndrome and autism and cerebral palsy that have high cost needs, private schools don't want our kids. They don't. And with the way this bill is constructed, they wouldn't have to take them. But the state still has an obligation to educate these kids. But if we redirect public funds to private schools, you're making it that much more difficult for the public schools to meet their current obligations.
How much is built into this model to measure whether you actually have a school or just a scam?
I don't believe there's any measure.
How about the quality of the teachers of these schools?
And I think that's been our experience with those states that have had private school. I'll pick on my friend from Florida with scholarships in Florida. You don't have to be licensed. Your teachers don't have to have credentials. There's no curriculum standards you have to meet. You don't even, and so the requirements on the entity that says they're a private school are virtually non-existent. And so it's all on the parent to have to decide if that's in fact an appropriate place for their child. And by the time may learn that that's not the case, it's too late to go back to the public schools. And so people are really caught between a rock and a hard place.
Could you, one of you, address the homeschool issue? I have run into parents in exceptional situations who are exceptional themselves and really are prepared to dedicate hours in a day to make sure there is a homeschool experience that is meaningful and a life experience that is meaningful. But I also have seen exactly the opposite in terms of people who are purportedly homeschoolers, which in fact say, I'm not going to bore him with books. He doesn't need books. He needs life experiences. Go next door and see if you can be an apprentice to this carpenter who just asked you to haul the boards in to build the addition to the house.
So I would say that, and I'll let the educators, but I have a very dear friend who has a PhD in special education, and she got her PhD, and some of her friends were getting PhDs in a musical instrument. And her friends would say, if I don't get a job in an orchestra, I'll just teach. And she would say to them, if I don't get a job in a school, I guess I'll just join the orchestra. And her point was that there's a science and knowledge to teaching that's real, that's important. And it isn't just anybody can do it because they're nice, right? Being nice and caring about kids does not make you a good teacher. Knowing how kids learn, knowing how to teach a curriculum, knowing how some kids are different, that's what makes a good teacher. There is a skill and a science and a profound amount of knowledge that comes with being a good teacher. It doesn't magically just happen.
Any others like to comment on these questions?
I would, being from Florida, where we are in the middle of the $8,000 a year per child if you choose to homeschool. And it's kind of like the Wild West. I was attending a State Board of Education meeting for a different issue, and they were discussing the accountability measures with one of the providers of the company that administers the $8,000. And their answer was, we really don't have any guidelines. So if a parent, and parents did, they took their children to pet dolphins in South Florida. They took them to Disneyland. The one couple said their son needed a screen for his computer, so they bought a 60-inch TV. To me, as a public school educator, I know how much that $8,000 can do for a child who's struggling to learn to read. And I also know how much skill and pedagogical knowledge I bring to that child. The best intentioned parent in the world who does not have a background in education is not going to be able to understand, diagnose, and remediate a learning disability in a child. It takes a professionally trained educator to make those decisions. And that, to me, is why a lot of children with complex learning needs remain in public schools. The money may be going to a private school or a homeschool voucher, but the child will bounce back to a public school where there is a staff of trained professionals who understand how to help Johnny learn how to read.
Dr. Henry?
Slightly different, but you already have a great example. And think about the debate for early childhood. The kids coming to kindergarten in our district, our principals can tell you without a doubt who had quality pre-K or who had parents that had time and expertise to support that child when they enter kindergarten. And then others who may say, well, we did stuff at home, but it wasn't with the same level of expertise or intensity. So the example is clear, and that's with pre-K. Having a qualified educator with time to invest, which absolutely can be a parent, but it doesn't work for everyone. That example's already there.
Are there any studies about restoring these kids to where they might have achieved if you identify that challenge?
There's very little research on homeschooling in general because we collect so little data on homeschoolers. And I mean, my view is really there are lots of different environments where kids across this country get a good education. Senator, it sounds like you got a wonderful education in Catholic schools growing up. I think there are kids who get a good education with homeschooling. For me, the question is, what is the best use of public funds and what protections ought to we expect when we're putting public funds into a kid's education? And whether it's Catholic schools, it's homeschooling, whatever it is, when we start to talk about programs that exclude kids because they have disabilities or because they're gay or because whatever it may be, I think that's where my questions come in. But what we know about homeschooling, what we know about private education is that kids get very different experiences. Some get good, some don't get so good, but it's very hard to know in the aggregate because we just don't test those students or have much data on them.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. I want to thank Senator Hirono, who I know had to go vote, for pulling this all together, and thank all of you for your testimony. And Katy, it's great to see you. We've worked together for years on issues of, helping kids with disabilities and people with disabilities. And Senator Durbin asked my first question, which was the discrimination impact of this. And so I think that is really worth underscoring, as you did. I have a question really for our educators and for Katy, and then one after that for you, Dr. Valant. So instead of providing for these huge tax cuts for very wealthy people and financing them in part by cutting Medicaid and food nutrition programs, and still having a huge deficit after that, we could do something that actually really helps people, which is fully fund IDEA, which is why for years I've introduced the IDEA full funding legislation, and I want to thank my colleagues for co-sponsoring that. We would really like to enlist your help in getting Republican co-sponsors here in the Senate who say that they support full funding for IDEA, but have not put their names on a bill that would actually accomplish that, while instead they're passing things like, or trying to pass things like this, this bill on the floor right now. But I just wanted to point out, and I think all of you who work in special ed know that for 50 years, Congress has failed to keep its promise to fully fund IDEA. It was a great law that was passed in the 1970s, and we committed at that time, we the federal government, to pay 40% of the costs. As of today, we're at less than 13%. We, the federal government, are only supplying about 13% of the costs for IDEA, and that's why I introduced the IDEA full funding bill, which puts us on a glide path using mandatory funding to get there. If we had done that, we would see, Ms. Underwood, the state of Florida would have received $2.1 billion more this year for students with disabilities. Dr. Henry, Kansas would have received an additional $355 million this year. And Mr. Schulte, the state of Nebraska, would have received an additional $246 million. Could you just briefly describe how that would be helpful to you when it comes to providing education to all our kids, and how that would be probably a better choice than a bill to provide tax breaks for the wealthy?
I'll go ahead and start. So I've come up to the Hill a number of years with the association. We've always tried, and we always talked about where we're currently at 13%. And when it says 40% mandate and it's not fully funded, then you know you're at a shortfall starting off. And I taught at Disney Elementary, and so we have an alternative curriculum program. And I talked a little bit about that in my written. And so they had 2 teachers, 14 students, but then we had an occupational therapist, we had a physical therapist, we had a speech pathologist, we had a nurse on duty because they had trachs, they had feeding tubes. So we almost had a one-on-one. They also had 4 para-educators. And so it was almost a one-to-one classroom, but we had to subsidize that. We had to absorb it because we are required to teach all of those students. But those students require so many additional services and needs and people in the classroom to help them. The problem is the funding isn't there. So when you are removing those funds and you're giving them to private schools and not fully funding it where we're at right now, that's where the problem comes in.
Yeah, thank you.
And sir, I will add, in Bay County, we could put that money to really good use by hiring more teachers that have my certification, that are qualified to work with what we call exceptional student education. There's a shortage of teachers in general. In my district, they choose not to pay ESE teachers any extra for working with additional paperwork requirements, which is a whole nother committee meeting. I know going into this school year that I will not have my own classroom because we don't have enough people with my license. So instead of having my own babies, I push into the rooms in which they reside during their language arts and reading classes and service them there. If we had more money, we could have more teachers with the right certifications, and we could pull together classes that would enable them to get there faster, so that by the time they get to high school, they can re-enter a regular ed mainstream class and be able to, with accommodations, perform equally as well as their regular ed peers. And then they're ready to go to college or trade school, and the world is their oyster.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Henry?
So you said all students, and IDA absolutely supports all students. And the debate we've had in Kansas is when you fully fund IDA at the federal level, it helps the state level and it helps the local level. I'm guessing if you ask the senators from Kansas, they've heard from the state legislators saying, you're putting us in a tough situation because the state and the local levels then making up the shortfall. The students with special needs are getting served. But every student is paying the price because those dollars are coming out of the general fund budget. So whether state or local, every family and every student is feeling the impact when the federal government doesn't fully fund IDA. So from a tax policy standpoint and doing what's right for all kids, fully funding IDA would be excellent.
No, I appreciate that because I think there are some states that, without the federal support, don't have the means to actually provide special ed kids with what we expect them to do. But others, when they try to take money from other parts of the budget, it obviously means other students are not getting full. So that is why I think we're talking about making sure that both special ed kids as well as all kids would benefit if the government just. Senator Hirono, I was thanking you for pulling this together. I do have one question, if I may, for Mr. Valant. And thank you for the research you've done on many aspects of this. Because Republicans, claim that this tax break will allow, lower income families to get the benefits, if there are greater benefits at all, from private education. I think our public education system is great if we fully fund it. That's why all our kids went to public schools. But I think some of the research shows that in states like North Carolina and Iowa, private schools have responded to some of these state tax breaks by increasing their overall tuition and actually taking that tuition to a place where lower income families, even with the tax cuts, cannot afford it. Could you talk about how this actually, what the Republicans are proposing here, actually worsens the disparities between working families and the relatively well-off families?
That is a real concern with these programs. So often the value of these vouchers, whether it's state ESA programs or it's tax credit scholarship programs, they don't come close to the actual cost of enrolling and paying for private school tuition, especially in some of the more desirable private schools. So where that leaves us is in a place where families may have to bridge several $1,000s a year to attend a private school, and it really doesn't necessarily open up many opportunities to those families. The families that get opportunities in that scenario are families that are already attending private schools who are essentially getting a cut in the price they're paying. And often, as you've said, and there's evidence of this from Iowa, there's an especially good study that finds evidence that when a private school choice program went into place, there was an increase in private schools' tuition rates. And so the fear in the long run, and there's actually some evidence of this from Chile, which is probably the country that has gone the farthest down this path. The fear in the long run is what happens is you get a terribly stratified education system because you have a large and growing private sector that is only available to the families that can bridge the difference between the value of the voucher and the cost of attendance, and a public sector that ends up underfunded and sort of left with anyone who cannot pay.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rono, and thank you to all of the witnesses who, and I really want to thank you for coming a long way to be here today, but just for what you do. It's so very important. I came in when my colleague, Senator Van Hollen, was asking about students with disabilities, and this is a particular worry of mine when you get into vouchers. And I remember the testimony that Secretary DeVos gave when she was the nominee back in 2017 to be Secretary of Education. And I asked her, you know, if should private schools, if they're getting vouchers, you know, should we only give vouchers if those schools agree to follow all the rules about students with disabilities that public schools do? And she said, basically, no. She said it should be a states' rights issue. It should be up to the state to decide what the policies would be. And so a parent of somebody with a disability, you know, might have to decide to move, you know, from their home because their own state didn't believe this was so important. I worry about schools that receive vouchers and whether they would comply with the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And my knowledge of many of the fine private schools in Virginia that I represent is they don't have the same programming for students with disabilities. Sometimes they're small, they can't financially do it. But if we move down that path, I think you're going to have an awful lot of students with disabilities who are not going to be getting this individualized education program that will enable them to fully achieve their potential. Is my worry like unjustified, or am I right to be worried about this?
Senator Kane, you have every right to be worried. Again, not every private school is going to deny enrollment to a student with a disability. Some of them are going to do a very good job. Many of them won't give these families the time of day. And it really depends on the leadership of the school, the culture of that school, what they want to do. Most private schools don't follow the federal special education law. They're not required to. And we know that when kids get the individualized supports they need, they're going to thrive. It's that simple. I wanted to say to Senator Van Hollen, I think as we talk about all these gazillions of dollars in budget reconciliation, to fully fund IDEA is about $26 billion. Yeah. We're right about 14, 15. But if you think about the significant number of dollars that are being thrown around in budget reconciliation, and $26 billion would end the debate for once and for all.
Now, is that 26 additional on top of the 14 or 15, or is that the delta? So
it's 26 in addition to what we're currently doing.
Okay, and that over 10 years is just a little bit more than what we're about to do on the estate tax giveaway.
Correct.
Like
So
if we didn't do the estate tax giveaway that is proposed, that amount of money could almost close the delta and enable us to fully fund the individuals with disabilities in education.
Right, and as my colleague from Kansas said, those funds help kids with disabilities, but they help all the kids by bringing in quality teachers, by getting the additional supports. And so it is a benefit to all of public education to have IDEA fully funded. So I think that's just an important tool. The other thing is for those places where there isn't a private school, but we've redirected all the public money out of the public system, and especially in rural areas where there aren't private schools, but you made it impossible for that public school to meet its mission.
Well, you've just anticipated the next question.
Sorry.
I wanted to ask you, Mr. Schulte or Dr. Henry, if I can, Senator Honer, do I still have time for one more question? And Dr. Henry, my mom's from El Dorado, Kansas, and I spent an awful lot of time in Wichita growing up visiting her in the farming community where she lived. My wife is just finished up an 8-year term on the Virginia State Board of Education, and the issue of charters and vouchers comes up a lot. And one of the issues that has always been raised is the business model can work in an area of dense population. You could have some concerns, but it doesn't really work in communities where the student population is not big, because those who would like to open these schools, they just don't see the student population to enable it to. And so you put money into a program like this, and you're guaranteeing that a lot of the money, disproportionately, it's going to go to urban and suburban areas and not rural areas. And that's an equity issue that I think you got to take seriously. Am I right to be worried about that, or am I oversimplifying it?
So when we were fighting vouchers in Nebraska, we found that 48 of our 93 counties in Nebraska have no private or parochial options. And so
Not
we-
a single one.
Not a single one.
48 of the 93 counties in Nebraska, not a single private or parochial option.
Correct. And what we find is when you get out to rural Nebraska, we literally have families that will go to the city. There might be a county school, and there's one school in the whole county. And there might be 2 or 3 families. They're going to have a house in that city together. They bring the kids in. A mom will stay with them during the school week. And then they go back out to the farms, to the ranches on the weekend to do the work. But it's over an hour drive for them to get to that school. And so that's one option in their county for school, much less a charter. That's not going to have an option. And so we know in Nebraska, it's not going to work.
And so that, back to Ms. Neas's point, so say 48 of your 93 counties, no parochial or private option, we do a voucher program, that doesn't really change, but it starts to pull more money into other jurisdictions. So the funding for the public schools in the areas where there's no other options gets diluted, potentially harming the educational quality for rural students who don't have any alternative.
Absolutely. As Dr. Henry said too, that enforces consolidation. And literally that little school is the heart of that community. And when that school closes or it moves, then that community dies. And so we're seeing that across Nebraska. But also going back to the funding for SPED, I mean, what we found in vouchers is they were promising in Nebraska, oh, well, we'll give you the voucher because you're going to be the priority student. It was SPED. And what they found, though, is, yeah, they could get the voucher, but then the services are going to be provided by the public schools. And they don't have the staff. They don't have the specialty, like I said, the ACP program. They don't have those teachers in the private schools. And so, but we at the public schools are required to provide those services for the students.
Well, the last thing I'll say then, Senator Honer, I'll hand it back to you. I mean, one of the things I've noticed about the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act is much education policy ends up with detractors who say we ought to repeal it, like we should repeal No Child Left Behind or whatever. Nobody has ever talked about repealing the IDEA. Even though people are not happy that we're not funding the full share, I've never heard a single person say, you know, we should repeal the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, because the delta in terms of what students have been able to achieve once there was a mandate for an individualized education plan and what they were achieving before speaks so well of this law that, of course, we want to do it. We wish there was better funding. The paperwork's too onerous. We got to make some changes. But we completely accept that this is a valid law that has really done a lot of good for a lot of people. Creating end runs around that, the basic core concept of IDEA, that would pull students and families into schools that would not meet these requirements that have really stood the test of time. I'm very, very concerned about it, and I'm really happy, Senator Rona, that you held this hearing.
I'll start. No.
So I would say in Nebraska, after 2 years of fighting the vouchers, it's very clear. But in Nebraska, they weren't aware that it was Congressman Adrian Smith who brought it forward. And I have his data from the election, his numbers that say his constituents don't support it. And so when I was here in February and we met with Congressman Smith, I said, why are you doing this? Nebraska we don't want vouchers, and you are supporting this bill. He has proposed it.
So I think that's a problem, that people are not aware that this is basically a support for a voucher system nationwide. First time ever. We have had various kinds of laws that would enable people to put away some money to pay for their own kids' private school education, but this is the first time that we're creating a system where, and don't ask me how the IRS is going to figure out as they try to determine when do they get to the $4 billion in tax credits that's allowed under this bill. They're going to have to figure that out. There are so many parts to implementation of this that raises concerns. However, I think the biggest challenge that we're facing right now is to enable the public to understand what's going on. So my question for you, Mr. Schulte, is how did the organizers in Nebraska get everybody to sign the petitions and to fight back on yet another effort to create a voucher system in Nebraska?
So it's interesting because Trump won the state, absolutely. But we won 57% of the state. And it comes down to those little towns like I'm talking about. I come from a small little town, Pleasanton, 350 people. You have the school, you have the bar, you have 3 churches, and that's it in our small little town. But that school is critical. You are there Friday nights watching the football games, watching the volleyball games. That is the life, and that is the heartbeat of that community. And they don't want to lose that school. And I've seen schools where they have had to consolidate. And so people were willing to come out and fight for their schools, and they signed signatures. And it wasn't just teachers that were collecting signatures. It was everybody. I mean, my mom was collecting them. And yes, related to education, but she was still collecting signatures because they know that that was so critical to Nebraska, and we wanted to fight it, and we fought vouchers for so long. And it was just getting out the people. But it was the second part, and it was because the people are the second house of Nebraska. We have the unicameral system, and so we had the right to bring that. And when Senator Lanahan worked around it and put it into a new bill and basically negated her first bill, people were mad. And they said, they took away my signature, my chance to vote on this. And so that's what, we got people mad in Nebraska, and they said, we're not going to take away our public schools because 90% of students in Nebraska are educated in public schools.
The key is for people to know that this is what's being proposed in the bill. So that there is evidence to suggest that the American people don't want vouchers. Isn't that right? Dr. Valant?
If I may, the Nebraska
please.
story is not unusual. So there have been well over a dozen times that the public has voted on some type of private school choice program, some type of voucher program, and every time it has been resoundingly defeated. So what happened in Nebraska, I mean, at the same time it was up in Nebraska, it was up in Colorado, it was up in Kentucky, and it's time after time it gets resoundingly defeated. I think because people pay attention when it shows up at the state level, and so there's an awareness of what is in those bills. I think what has been happening with ECHA right now is that it's buried in a budget reconciliation bill where it's just not particularly high on people's awareness and priority list. And there was another run at passing a tax credit scholarship program at the federal level a few years ago when it was a standalone bill, and it didn't go very far. And I do think that that part of the story of this bill and its likely outcome relates to the fact that it is just not the piece of this legislation that people are paying the most attention to.
If we want to fight this provision, which I think is very harmful, and would you all agree that letting the public know that this is in the bill and it's going to be a huge change to the way public schools are supported in our country, that it would make a difference?
Yeah,
Yes? So this spotlight hearing is being streamed, by the way, and for each of you represent institutions, organizations that you could communicate to as to what's in this bill, and so you get a groundswell, I would think, of awareness that we each are, as far as I'm concerned, should be responsible for communicating to people. Now, I just heard I was asked by a reporter, well, what do I think about the fact that the Republicans, frankly, Senator Cassidy, who chairs the Education Committee here, is taking the lead in describing this provision as the biggest plus for school choice ever. I am paraphrasing. But it sounds good. Now, I would like to ask each of you, what is the counter to this fallacy that this actually is going to expand education opportunities for everybody, and isn't that going to be great? Let's just go down the line. What is the counter to this argument that this is the best school choice ever?
I'm not sure this is a counter so much as I actually think it would be the largest federal school choice program, and I think that we should be paying attention to that, and in particular, that this would be a 50-state program that, it would be in effect in Hawaii, and it would be in effect in California and Massachusetts, just like it would
And
be
there
in
are people who
Louisiana.
might say, isn't that great?
And there's not precedent for that when it comes to private school choice programs being passed at the federal level that touch all 50 states.
So what I'm asking is really, how do we counter this? Because judging from the testimony that you provided, it is not as though the voucher system is going to result in higher academic achievements for kids who go to private schools, because they do not have to meet the same kind of criteria that a public schools need to face. So, I'm looking for some counter to what sounds like a really positive part of this bill.
So Senator, many private schools refuse to enroll students with disabilities, pure and simple. So and students with disabilities represent a minimum of 15% of kids in public education. So if you're automatically excluding those kids, where are they supposed to go, right? They're supposed to go to the public schools, and you've taken billions of dollars away from the public schools, and yet they still have their obligations. So private schools are allowed to discriminate and to exclude kids with disabilities. So not every child and not every family will benefit from
Yes,
this.
there's absolutely nothing in this bill that creates this voucher tax credit system that will require the private schools to provide any level of anything much. You just hand over your contributions. So anyone else on the panel want to weigh in? Yes.
I haven't read the bill, but from what you described, there's very little in terms of measurement and accountability embedded that goes along with the money. And one thing that education knows is what cannot be measured cannot be improved.
Mr. Schultz, you want to weigh in?
Well, I guess my response is, are you going to take all students? That's what it comes down to for me. Public education, we were required, and we take all students no matter where you're at, no matter your disability, your ability, and we educate you and we accept you. And there are so many ways that they can exclude you, and it's just not acceptable. And so as a teacher for 26 years, I'm going to work with any student, all students, and they're not.
Dr. Henry?
I would answer this from the perspective of thousands of superintendents and school districts across the nation. And the key is taking time to communicate with your parents. And it's hard, because we go back to the fact that to be a parent, you have to have kids. And when you have kids, you're very busy. And you don't realize the negative impact, whether it's at the federal level or state level, on legislation that's going to impact your child until it's too late. So part of the responsibility comes back to local school districts in making sure we truly engage with our parents and help them understand and answer the question, what is best for your child? Because that's all every parent wants. And our public schools do a great job of supporting that.
Isn't there also evidence that a voucher system merely enables, supports kids who are already going to private schools, and it doesn't expand opportunities for others, including of the fact that there's a gap between the cost to go to private school and what the vouchers provide in terms of scholarships, and who's supposed to make up that difference? And there are lots of families who won't be able to make up that difference. Isn't that another observation? Yeah. Hello, Amy. I'd like to call on Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Senator Rona, for holding this important Spotlight Forum. I think many of you know I care a lot about education, a proud product of the public schools, as my daughter was as well. And my mom taught second grade till she was 70 years old. I still have people come up to me and tell me about how she was their favorite teacher many years later. Her favorite unit to teach was the monarch butterfly unit. Maisie's heard this story, but she would dress up as a butterfly with the antennas and wings and a tunic and carry a sign that said "To Mexico or Bust." But the most extraordinary part of the story, after she released the butterfly, she would tell me, and all the kids are around her watching the butterfly after watching the metamorphosis, would be when she would go to a grocery store afterward. And she always told me she went, I never knew why till she died and at her visitation. this family came up, and the mom was crying, and she had a son with her that was disabled, and he was older. And she said it was her son's favorite class in second grade, and that my mom would always go to that grocery store after she taught the unit for 10 years later, year after year after year in that outfit, because he had a job bagging groceries, and she'd stand in line and give him a big hug. So to me, that's teachers, that's education, that's the love that they bring to the classroom and that you all bring to this topic. So Maisie was just talking about the big, beautiful betrayal of a bill and what it does in terms of families and kids. I'm the ranking member on the Ag Committee, so I am especially focused on the SNAP cuts and some of the nutrition cuts, which are extraordinarily high. $300 billion coming out the House, knocked down to about $200 billion in the Senate, and then knocked down further this week by the parliamentarian to about 140-some billion. But we have now learned that the Republicans are refiling the SNAP cuts just today in some way to try to meet the parliamentarians' ruling. So there we go, but every single day we're fighting this. And Mr. Schulte, as an educator, can you talk about what the termination of basic food assistance and school meals will mean for our kids and their ability to learn?
Absolutely. So I teach in a Title I school currently, and my kids arrive early and they get breakfast. We know that if they don't have breakfast, they're not going to be ready to learn. And so I would say 75% of my students receive free and reduced, and they go and eat their breakfast, they come out into the classroom, and then they're ready to go. They also have the lunch program, but then I also know during the summer we have our summer program, and so I have students that are coming up to the school and they're getting their food because we know they have backpack programs for the weekend. If they don't have that backpack filled with food, they might not eat on the weekends, and they're going to come to school hungry. And so every dollar that goes into that program helps the kids, and that's at the end of the day. I also saw students during COVID where we had our schools open. They were able to pick up their breakfast and their lunches and dinners, and we fed them because that was their priority. Even though they weren't in schools, they needed that support.
Very good. And just, I think both you, Dr. Henry, while you're in Wichita, I talked to your governor yesterday, by the way, about this very topic of SNAP. But you get a sense of rural schools, even though you are in a mid-sized town there, just the effect that some of this is going to have on rural schools, unique challenges. Dr. Henry.
I think when people start to think about schools and poverty, they immediately think about urban schools. And to your point, poverty in rural states and rural communities is a real thing. It's just maybe the spotlight isn't always there. So really having that conversation in rural states, whether it's Kansas or Nebraska, about how this is going to impact families, because it sounds great until it impacts your child. And as Paul indicated, when a student isn't being cared for and they don't have access to food, they can't learn. It's that simple.
Very good. I can see my colleague has come here, Senator Hassan, who's been such an advocate for schools, and I will turn it back to Maisie. So thank you, Senator Hirono.
Thank you very much. Senator Klobuchar, Senator Hassan,
Well, thank
thank you
you.
for joining us.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for organizing us and hosting this important forum. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. We really appreciate you and what you do. And I have two questions, and I wanted to start with you, Dr. Henry, on the first one, and then I think I'll also ask Mr. Schulte to address it as well. Public schools frequently face different spending decisions due to insufficient funding, like deciding whether they can hire more teachers to reduce classroom sizes or buy the latest high-quality textbooks and instructional materials to improve academic outcomes. Yet, as public schools across the country face serious budget issues, Republicans want to hand out billions of dollars in tax giveaways to fund private school vouchers. Dr. Henry, how would taking away money from public schools to give more money to private schools impact students in your district?
In every way. I mean,
Yeah.
resources matter. We can have the debate and discussion all day long about where you put resources and how that impacts kids.
Right.
But resources do matter. What impacts a child is having the best possible teacher you can find.
Yeah.
And when you divert dollars, now you're making it more difficult for anyone to recruit teachers. We don't pay our teachers near enough.
Right.
Not at the start, not at the end. And all they do is give everything they have to impact kids.
Right.
So I think you can start the debate with, if you're going to divert dollars, you're absolutely hurting every district's chance to recruit high-quality teachers because the resources have been cut.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Schulte?
So as I shared, I teach in Title I school, and I think, first of all, those funds help in reading specialists. We have a math specialist. We have an ELL service. And so those services are going to be cut first because they're not seen as critical, but they are for those students. And when you have to make those decisions, I mean, whether it's the paraprofessional that is in the classroom supporting you or having extra teachers, I mean, it is critical to every school, whether you're small, rural, urban, metro, it's critical.
Right.
Those fundings are critical.
And it's especially, you know, to me, disturbing that these vouchers are now going to be used to subsidize wealthy families who are already sending their children to private schools because they have the resources to, and they've decided to do that, which is, of course, their right, but draining away resources from schools like the ones you're talking about. I just visited recently a Title I school in New Hampshire and arrived on a snowy, very cold day. It was Friday. The kids, it was kindergarten through, I think, 5th grade. The kids had been inside all week, no outdoor recess. And I was thinking, okay, this is going to be interesting. They wanted me to speak to the whole school. They were sitting quietly in the gym, respectful, voices down. They were in control of their selves, their bodies. They were being kind to each other. They interacted with me well. And a lot of that had to do with that Title I funding, but also the other supports that very wonderful team at the school had put together that really supported these kids in ways that I think a lot of people don't know happens, right? And so it's just a reminder of what really good principals and teachers and families can do together when they've got the resources to do it. Mr. Valant, I wanted to ask you a question. I know Senator Kane asked a different witness essentially the same question, but I wanted to get your perspective. In many states, private schools are concentrated in suburbs and cities. Can you explain how private school voucher programs underserve rural communities and harm the stability of public school systems?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And it's a really basic fact that there just aren't as many private schools in rural areas. And we looked at ninth graders and what ninth grade families across the country face. And it's actually less than 30% of ninth grade families have a private school within 5 miles of their home.
Yeah.
So if you don't have private schools nearby and you have a voucher system that really is set up to provide funding for private schools, those families aren't going to benefit to the degree that urban families and suburban families that have a lot of private schools around their homes do. And so where that takes us is to a place where we have states' resources or federal resources that are being redirected to other communities.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of rural families looking around and saying, wait a minute, I'm not sure how I could benefit from this.
Yeah, and look, it's also hard even with public charter schools. It's harder in rural areas just because to get to scale, to be able to operate a school that is separate from the public school is a real challenge. And instead of just focusing on making the public school as excellent as we possibly can, this is just kind of another way of undermining it. It seems to me, and I think the data indicates, as you've just said.
I think it does. And I would point out, too, that it's often rural schools that are most starved for resources as
Yeah.
it is. So
Yeah.
if there were a place to invest, rural schools are certainly high on that list.
Yeah. Well, I thank you all for the work you do. Again, Senator Hirono, thank you for shining a spotlight on this issue. And we will continue to work as hard as we can to
Thank
help you
very-
build strong public schools. Thanks.
Thank you. There is a commitment to public schools, and as I said, that this regime is attacking public schools in a way that I have never encountered. And it is going to be so important for all of us to get the word out, to the American public who, time and again, the polls have shown that they do not support a voucher system. What they want is stronger support for our public school systems. So one other thing that I wanted to point out, though, doesn't this bill enable individuals to contribute appreciated stocks for which they will get the full tax credit? And so no capital gains taxes need to be paid for contributing appreciated stocks to this program? Anybody want to respond to that?
I'm happy to, because I think this is one of the more important parts of the bill and one of the hardest for people to see and understand, is yes, so a donor, and I put donor in air quotes, because donors in this program are not actually donating money, they make money off of this program. And so a donor who gives money to a scholarship granting organization can give stock, not cash, but can give stock. And if they made money on that stock, they will never pay capital gains taxes on their earnings, but they'll get the full value of the stock back as a tax credit. So the donors in ECA actually make money off of it, which is why ECA is almost certain to be fully funded right from day one, because there's actually a financial incentive to donate to this program as opposed to it being something that resembles philanthropy.
And I'm sure the rest of the panelists were aware of this particular element in the bill. This is another thing that, as far as I'm concerned, we need to let the public know. By the way, who owns stocks that they can afford to contribute? I would say some of the richer people in our country. So I do have a perspective. You gathered that, right? and I think that the commitment to supporting our public schools must remain strong, because the majority, as I said, majority of our kids go to public schools. And teachers can be a huge difference in our outlook, all of that. When we heard about Senator Klobuchar's mother and the impact she had on her students. And I recall that of all of my students, and I moved about every 2 years because I'm an immigrant and we kept moving to a better place. So it was really hard to make friends. But the one teacher that I kept in touch with always was my 6th grade teacher. And believe me, moving every 2 years, I had quite a few teachers, but my 6th grade teacher showed a concern for a poor immigrant kid like me, and it made a huge impact. So our educators need our support. And so I would ask, first of all, I thank you all for your participation and the information that you provided, and I would really ask each of you to figure out how you can communicate the information about this bill and what the impact of this kind of support to our private schools could mean in terms of basically less resources for public schools. Because when you're talking about $4 billion a year in the Senate bill in perpetuity, that we will not be having the benefit of to use for supporting public schools or any other important program, I think it needs to be told. This is a story that needs to be told. And Mr. Schulte, your story of how your community loved this school that was in your neighborhood, and Ms. Underwood, you're talking about in times of crises that it is the schools that are open. It is the public schools generally that are open and that enable the community to recognize the schools as a huge part of what we rely on. So thank you, each and every one, and I know how to get in touch with you as we go forward. I intend to hold, there will probably be more of these hearings to make sure that our community and the American people understand what's in this bill. But frankly, if we don't do something about it, this bill is going to pass with this provision. And we're likely voting on this bill this Friday. So your participation is very timely. So I will adjourn this spotlight hearing, and once again, mahalo nui loa to each and every one of you.